Dr. Carly Batist is the science outreach lead at WILDLABS.NET, a non-profit organization that combines ecoacoustics, camera trapping, eDNA, and AI to deliver a comprehensive understanding of biodiversity. Carly is a key and long-term member of the Wild Labs community, and she's a strong advocate for our Horizon Scan initiative. And so today we're very excited to have Carly share her expertise on integrating bioacoustics data into policy frameworks to help achieve global conservation goals. Carly, wonderful to welcome you as an expert. Do you want to take it away?
Hi, everyone. I'm Carly. As Steph says, working at WILDLABS.NET, where we're doing a whole lot of conservation tech work, bioacoustics among it. And what I wanted to kind of talk about here is using bioacoustics to track progress towards global frameworks, emerging markets, and nature MRV, so monitoring, reporting, and verification. So just to kind of start off with, the nature tech and MRV space is growing at an absolutely unprecedented pace. There are a huge number of startups, nonprofits, et cetera, that are in existence now. So just to give you an idea, the Matthias Boissonneau and a couple other folks tried to map the nature tech ecosystem. I'll post a link to this LinkedIn. It was on LinkedIn if you want to check it out. But just to give you an idea, these are all like organizations and people in the nature tech space. So really growing immensely. And a lot of that has to do with the passing of these big global frameworks, both involuntary and voluntary, such as the Global Biodiversity Framework, different corporate frameworks, et cetera, that I'll touch on a bit today. So one of the biggest ones was the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework, which outlines 23 targets that the world needs to achieve by 2030 to achieve just halt biodiversity loss, to contribute to the Sustainable Development Goals, et cetera. And each of these targets has a headline indicator to assess how, if it's been achieved or not, and then also component and complementary indicators. And ahead of COP16, which is happening in Cali in just a couple of weeks, countries are expected to be submitting their NBSAPs, their National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans, which outline per country how each of them is going to achieve these 23 targets and which specific indicators they're going to be using to do so. So those 23 targets are seen here. Again, I put all of the links in a Word doc that I'll post in the chat after. So there's a link to this as well in that, but this outlines kind of all of the themes and targets. There's kind of a section about reducing threats to biodiversity, about meeting people's needs for sustainable use, and then also kind of tools and solutions for implementation and kind of putting biodiversity through every layer of our society. So I'm just going to go through a couple and show kind of how bioacoustic surveys can be used to inform these targets and our progress towards them. But that you could definitely make a case for bioacoustic monitoring to be included in many more than I'm even just describing here. So the first one to note is target 2, which is the kind of lesser known 30 by 30, which is restoring 30% of all degraded ecosystems. The big 30 by 30 of conserving 30% is actually target 3. So we'll get there in a second. And there's actually a ton of work that's been done in both the marine and freshwater space and the terrestrial space on using acoustic indices to understand how coral reefs are recovering, or seagrass is being restored, all sorts of things like that, as well as in the terrestrial space, where a lot of times we're comparing species richness in the restoration sites compared to baselines. So that could be comparing it to a traditional kind of agricultural or degraded land as sort of a bad baseline, if you will, and then a nearby, undisturbed or primary forest or something like that. as kind of the baseline that you're working towards in the restoration process. So by using acoustic monitoring to kind of look at the species richness and composition across different habitats, the restoration sites included, we can help kind of see how well those restoration sites are moving, in theory, ideally towards the good baseline and away from the degraded baseline. Target 3, as I mentioned, is the classic 30 by 30. And of course, this is going to be really important in monitoring species in protected areas. So technically the headline target here is just the spatial coverage of protected areas. But there's a really important need to avoid paper parks here, which is where, you know, on paper it says that this area is protected, but actually on the ground it's not. So I think monitoring these protected areas is incredibly important. And also assessing priority areas to create new parks or reserves. So to meet this 30 by 30, there's going to need to be an expansion of protected area networks within countries. And so understanding where species-rich areas are to kind of prioritize where new protected areas would best fit is also really important. So using acoustic monitoring to look at things like species richness, composition, the presence of endangered or endemic species, etc. Target 4 is halting species extinction, which largely is looking at species threatened statuses. And so obviously this is pretty clear, right? We can monitor tons of endangered and endemic species through acoustic monitoring. I, of course, had to include a lemur picture because that's what I studied. These little black and white rough lemurs are what I studied for my PhD using acoustic monitoring. So we can use acoustic monitoring to monitor endangered and endemic species, inform updates to the IUCN Red List, understand population trends, things and distributions, things like that. Target 6 focuses on reducing the introduction and impact of invasive species. And so again, there's many invasive species that we can detect with acoustics, and this has been done a number of times, a lot in islands, particularly with detecting the spread of invasive species across archipelagos. So a number of my colleagues, including Marconi Campos, did work on this in Puerto Rico, and we're continuing work on this now in the nearby US Virgin Islands to map the spread of invasive species. Target 8 focuses on minimizing the impacts of climate change. And this is the indicators are a bit kind of more murky here because they're using a lot of binary indicators that are just yes, no, the country has policies or doesn't have policies. But having those policies requires us to understand the impacts of natural disasters. There's a ton of work that's been done on the impacts that hurricanes have on acoustic indices kind of before or after a hurricane or wildfires. We can also use the species presence data we get from acoustic monitoring in habitat suitability models or species distribution models to try to see kind of how range shifts are going to happen with climate change. And to kind of help see how what areas will need to be buffered to accommodate for species increasing or shifting their ranges. Target 10 is focusing on enhancing sustainability in fisheries, forests, agriculture, things like that. And so this is really important to kind of assess how different regenerative ag practices or sustainable agroforestry, forest garden approaches are impacting wildlife. And so we're working on a project right now at Wildmon with Terragenesis and the VF Foundation to assess how using regenerative rubber farming is benefiting biodiversity compared to traditional agricultural practices, which is usually clear cutting. And this is directly influencing policy because the VF Foundation is the foundation arm of VF, which manages brands like North Face, Vans, Timberland, and they get their rubber to make shoes and clothes from these farmer co-ops. This is in Thailand that we're doing this work. So there's a huge market now for regenerative rubber that we're kind of informing the use of by assessing like how well it's impacting or benefiting biodiversity on top of all of the other carbon benefits, soil benefits, etc. There's also a target that is discussing that is focused on businesses assessing and disclosing their biodiversity risks and impacts, which there's a whole alphabet soup of disclosure frameworks now that are occurring that I've listed here below, where companies are being either through a voluntary or involuntary framework being required to disclose their impacts on biodiversity and their nature risks. So most of them are voluntary, except for the EUDR, which is required by law at the end of this year. So that requires that any import of certain commodities like cacao, palm oil, soy are coming from deforestation-free supply chains after 2020. And so that's a huge thing because it's actual policy now. There's a number of targets as well that are focused on kind of strengthening capacity building, ensuring that knowledge is accessible to everyone, increasing scientific cooperation. And as we talked about with the networks session that we had a couple of weeks ago, there's a number of big networks that can help to support these targets. So a really great one that's a national scale is the Australian Acoustic Observatory, which is showing their sites here, as well as the TERN super sites. That's another network in Australia. But there's a number of countries that are building out national specific biodiversity platforms, like Colombia, Rwanda, Kenya. The EU is working on an EU-wide monitoring system and protocol. And all of this is kind of trying to feed into the moonshot goal of having a GBIOS, a global biodiversity observation system, which that's work that Andy Gonzalez and the GeoBond folks are trying to kind of bring into fruition with the formation of these local bonds or biodiversity observation networks around the world. I would also argue it's really important to kind of focus on citizen science networks too. Another good example from Australia is Frog ID, which is Frog ID Week is a week where everyone just goes out and records different frogs and to detect all these different frogs in Australia around the country. So yeah, definitely want to also be bringing in all of these citizen science frameworks. The Global Biodiversity Framework obviously is international, but there's also national level frameworks that are coming into play that are involuntary, like they're coming into law. So you might have heard of the Biodiversity Net Gain Market, or BNG, in the UK, which shows that all new development must show 10% biodiversity uplift if you're developing any land. Australia is developing the Nature Repair Market, which is the first national level voluntary biodiversity market. And the EU just got implemented the Nature Restoration Law, so that each EU country has to report to the EU how they're restoring degraded land. Obviously, there's a lot of debate over what counts as degraded land, but that's something that just came into play this year. And just to kind of do a brief intro to the land of credits, which usually results in some sort of reaction like this, because we get into finance and none of us were economics majors, except for the few of you that I know are specific environmental economics folks. But it's important because there's a ton of private finance that's coming into this, and conservation always needs funding. And so thinking about new biodiversity financing structures is super important. So with credits, there's both kind of a stream for carbon credit co-benefits and biodiversity credits themselves. So there's a huge emphasis now on understanding the holistic impact of carbon projects so that they fit what's called like a CCB standard, climate, community, and biodiversity. And all the big carbon credit developers, Verra, Plan Vivo, Gold Standard, et cetera, are in the process of developing actual biodiversity methodologies that will be included in their carbon crediting schemes. And so to give you an example of a project that we're doing as well at Wild with Katona and Trees for the Future, we're using acoustic monitoring to evaluate how carbon credited agroforestry parcels called forest gardens impact biodiversity in Homa Bay in Kenya compared to conventional farming. So these forest gardens are carbon credited, but now we're also adding a biodiversity component to it to see how they're also impacting local wildlife. I know I'm probably over time, I promise I'm wrapping up stuff. Biodiversity credits themselves, very new. The definition literally is still up for debate. There's a huge list that Seamus Gradicas from Bloom Labs has developed of all of these different biodiversity credit schemes. But the fundamental kind of unit is that it's a certificate that represents a measured and evidence-based unit of positive biodiversity outcome that is durable and additional to what would have otherwise occurred. So it's placing a value in very specifically like a dollar value on nature, which obviously a lot of debate about it, but it is a new kind of biodiversity financing scheme that has great potential to flood a ton of money from the private sector into on-the-ground action. I'll link to a PDF that talks about different biodiversity schemes using a cooking metaphor, which actually is very helpful and very easy to digest. So if you're like, oh my God, biodiversity credits, what? I would highly recommend checking that out. And the reason that these are important is because how you assign value and how you assign credits depends on how you are monitoring that area, like how you are quantifying it. And usually these biodiversity credit schemes have a combination of ecosystem condition, which is some sort of remotely sensed metric, and ecosystem quality, which is some kind of on the ground, like species specific or community level metric. So species presence and absence, which you can get from acoustic monitoring, is used in almost all of them. And so acoustic monitoring on top of other types of conservation technologies are going to be really key in establishing these credit systems and validating them in a transparent way. That being said, this all requires integrating technologies. And so I know that we've talked about the whole point of this is acoustics, but combining different in situ sensors is really, really important. And a lot of the work that we're doing at WildLabs is trying to bridge all of these different in situ sensors together to be able to fulfill all of these different global frameworks and crediting schemes in a comprehensive way. So thank you so much. I know I've thrown a ton of information out. I will post that Word doc of links. And then if anyone would like me to send them the slides, I'm happy to do so. I might just post them on LinkedIn for ease of sharing. But yeah, thanks so much.
Thanks so much, Carly. That was so interesting, and just I feel like we've been given a tour of biodiversity frameworks, and it was just such a great introduction to the policy side and linking across to on the ground impact. I'm not going to give you many. I might give you one question because that was quite a long talk, which forgiven. I don't want to get. I think we can save a discussion for credits and whether credits are the best way to access private finance till the after hours discussion. I'm going to ask you about that. But I would love to see, I'd love to hear your thoughts about what do you think the biggest challenges and opportunities in transitioning from, you talked about a lot of individual case studies where bioacoustics could be used. What do you think the biggest challenge is to transition to a global scale monitoring system with all of these data sources?
Honestly, just like logistics, like who's gonna own it, who's gonna run it, like where's it gonna be based, and who's paying for it, all of those kinds of things. I think just like we have so much data, it would be like the data part and stuff isn't even like the hard part. It's literally just the logistics of like herding the cats of the world, the proverbial cats of the world to kind of all get on the same page and decide on these these kind of logistical questions that I think is going to be the biggest hurdle.
Awesome. Carly, I'm going to drop you into the chat because there's lots of questions and commentary happening. Thank you so much.
Okay.